In this video, I'm going to talk about embracing difficult lighting in wildlife photography. Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. It's quite often that you hear wildlife photographers say that their favorite lighting conditions are an abundance of soft light. It's true that soft constant light is easier to work with, but if you only ever shoot in optimum lighting conditions, a lot of your photos will start to look the same, not to mention looking the same as the photos other people are taking. You might also be missing out on some great opportunities to capture unique behaviors, scenes, or stories, as well as opportunities to get creative with the light. If you're in a studio and you're using artificial lighting for portraits, soft constant light is unlikely to be at the top of your list, or it's certainly unlikely to be the only lighting setup you use. Instead, it's much more likely that you would shape the light with sources that are highly directional, and some of them might even be hard light sources like the light that's shining on me right now. It's much harder to photograph wildlife in natural settings as you can't control the lighting and you can't simply position the subject or the lighting, although you can sometimes move yourself and the camera, although you may not be able to get to the position you want at the time you need to be there. Additionally, natural light, which will typically be the sunlight, will constantly change, so you have to keep watching it and reacting appropriately. Let's start by talking about a few different types of lighting. I'm going to divide this video into two main sections. The first section is one in which I'll talk about what I call extreme exposure scenarios, and that's where we'll probably spend the most time. Let's start with harsh light or hard light. Harsh light is probably the lighting that scares away photographers more than any other. The good thing about harsh light is that the abundance or overabundance of light can help to show a lot of detail and separate elements in the image. And this can be especially helpful if your camera and lens combination needs a lot of light to avoid higher ISOs. There are three common problems with harsh light. The first is that the shadows can be very strong, like the shadow that you see behind me right now. Secondly, you may have trouble figuring out the exposure because you've got areas that are very bright and shadows that are very strong. And thirdly, the light can actually be very flat in some cases because it's the same light everywhere if there's harsh light blanketing the scene, even though there's a lot of light. So here's a few tips. Firstly, a lot of people ask me about polarizers, and generally I don't bother with a polarizer, even though I actually do have a drop-in filter for my longest lens, and I typically always have it with me. But unless I'm shooting in one direction for a long period where I know the polarizer will help, and I know it's not going to impact the shutter speeds that I need, I prefer to just try to capture as much dynamic range and detail in the image as possible and then tone down the relevant parts of the scene in post-processing. Secondly, often we're composing images and we say, watch your backgrounds, as a reminder that you don't want to just get overly focused on the subject and forget about the rest of the scene. When you're composing not just the subject, but also the background, you sometimes realize that you may have to change your position or perspective so that the background behind the subject changes. With harsh light, you may also have to watch your shadows, and just as with backgrounds, changing your position or perspective when shooting will give you some degree of control over where the shadows fall, which might include having them fall outside of the frame. The third tip I have for you is that images with harsh light are where you really might need to spend a little more time in post-processing. I'm sure I'm not the only one who would rather be behind the camera than editing images, but images with harsh light often require some extra work, but it can be totally worth the effort. For example, you may need to burn things that are too hot, like pieces of bright or wet foliage that are reflecting harsh sunlight, and you may have to dodge some things like eyes that are too dark. You may also find it helpful to go into the color mix and selectively increase or decrease the luminance of certain colors. Often with harsh light, you have to underexposed to avoid losing detail in bright areas, and as a result you may have to do some extra work in post to bring the image back up to how it looked at the time, but with some careful tweaks to contain the dynamic range throughout. You may also have to go low key, which is something we'll talk about shortly. The fourth tip I have for you is that if the light really is not great because it's so harsh, make sure there are other aspects of the image that are great if you're going to keep that image. If you remember my video on 5 ways to make your images more impactful, you might remember that apart from light, the other ways to make images strong were behavior, scene, story, and emotion. So make sure one or more of those things is great in your image if the light is not so great. And my last tip is don't be one of those people who doesn't shoot without your lens hood on. I see this sometimes, and the hood not only protects your front element of your lens, but also makes your images better, and especially when you're dealing with harsh light, you really want to have your lens hood on. And also as a bonus, I should mention that when there's harsh light and you've got a really good background blur, you can sometimes get great bokeh or bokeh balls in the background or in the foreground of your image, assuming that your lens will render those in a pleasing way. Let's talk about low light. Low light is another situation that scares away photographers. Obviously, we need light to make photos, and when we're trying to photograph moving subjects with high-resolution cameras, noise in images can be an issue. You have to be realistic about the limitations of low light, including the limitations of your gear. Low light is one of the primary reasons I shoot with fast prime lenses. If you're concerned about high ISOs and you have some shorter lenses with bigger apertures, then consider going for wider shots with better image quality over tighter shots that are noisy. This is why, in addition to the 400 f2.8 that I usually shoot with, I also have a 135 f1.8 and a 24 f1.4. It's also important to know what you can get away with in terms of slow shutter speeds. Most of the images I'm showing you now were shot with shutter speeds under 1/500th and sometimes as low as 1/40th. Obviously, when you're shooting with speeds that low, unless you really want to capture motion blur, you have to shoot at strategic times, which is when the animal is not moving. Now, I'm a big advocate of hand holding when shooting typical faster shutter speeds, but when you're shooting with slow shutter speeds, you need more help with stabilization. I'm always in favor of getting lower where possible, so I suggest using a bean bag or a locked gimbal or ball head on a platypod rather than a tripod or monopod, because a tripod or monopod will usually put you up too high and you won't get the right perspective with those kinds of devices. So let me show you what I mean. So here is a bean bag. This is the one that I often carry with me. It's very lightweight, but if you are concerned about the space that this will take in your luggage, one thing you can do is just empty out the filling inside, and when you get to your location, just fill it up with sand or rice or beans or something else. Now, the other thing I want to show you is this device here, which is what I mentioned before. It's called a platypod. So this is basically just a metal plate, and it has some little legs in here that screw out and go into this little box here. And basically, this thing, you can have the legs, either the pointy side can be pointing down into the ground, like into the dirt, or you can have the rubber feet at the bottom resting on the ground. And then what you do is you put a ball head or a gimbal head on top of this plate here. It screws in, and then you can have your camera in that head. And so then you've got a stable platform for shooting, but it's one that's very low. And that will allow you to shoot with slower shutter speeds and increase the likelihood that you won't get any blur due to destabilizing the image. Obviously, when you're shooting with slow shutter speeds, to compensate for motion blur, you always want to make sure that you're bursting and capturing several frames, and then you can choose the sharpest one. You should generally be doing this anyway, but especially when you're shooting with slow shutter speed, that's particularly important to do that. If you have the opportunity and the animal will stick around for a while, This is where you want to try a whole range of shutter speeds, including some where you aim for the cleanest low ISO images you can. So don't necessarily start super slow, but perhaps start at a speed where you know the image might be a little bit noisy, but perhaps you can clean it up in post, and then work your way down to slower shutter speeds, always capturing bursts of images along the way. Another tip is when you don't have a lot of light, it's very tempting when you have the ability to recover shadows in post with raw images. You have to be careful. Don't go crazy on that because often you can be introducing noise. The other thing is that you don't want to reveal so much that you're actually losing the depth and the drama that shadows can provide. When some things are hidden, it leaves more to the imagination and the viewer is left wondering what's there. So this is actually a good time to talk about low-key photography. Low-key images are images where most of the photo is dark. In these images, you embrace the shadows and you embrace the blacks. They can be very powerful, and not surprisingly, they can look great in black and white. The darkness in low-key images can come about in two ways. One way is because of low light, which means that there's naturally a lot of darkness. Or the darkness seen in the final image can be the result of intentionally underexposing the image when it was shot, or editing it later to reduce the exposure. One reason you might want to intentionally underexpose is because you're actually in a harsh light situation and there's so much light that it's blowing out details. If you underexpose, you can keep the details in the light areas, but it also means you'll end up turning a lot of the rest of the image much darker. Now sometimes as you're figuring out the exposure for shots like this, you realize that instead of just going halfway, you might as well go further and embrace the darkness and really underexpose. Sometimes you have to decide how low key you're going to go in the camera. When I'm shooting low key, I typically don't try to underexpose in the camera any more than I have to, so that I have some flexibility in post. It's easy to burn things or further reduce the exposure of the image in post, but not so easy to get things brighter without potentially introducing noise. In low-key images, while there's a lot of darkness, there's still an obvious source of light. And in fact, that light source may actually be very bright, but it will be highly directed or shaped so that it's not going to light up the entire scene. If you're in a studio, you might use light modifiers like grids or barn doors to achieve this kind of effect. In wildlife photography, you might either be using an artificial light source, and to be clear, I'm not talking about flash because we don't want to do that to a wildlife subject, so I'm only talking about continuous sources of light, or the light source might be shaped naturally by something like trees or rocks. Or you might be doing some things in post-processing, or it could be some combination. One thing to remember when you're exposing and editing low-key images is that with so much darkness in the image, a viewer's eye will be drawn to anything that's bright. This is always the case with all images, but it's even more so with a low-key image. So if there's something in the image that's bright, but it's just a distraction or it somehow detracts from the image, you might be best just to burn it or clone it out if you're comfortable with that. Let's talk about the opposite of low-key, which is high-key. High-key photography is where you embrace the whites and the highlights. It's an image where most of the image is mostly white or bright. Just as with low-key photography, high-key photography can look great when it's rendered in black and white. High-key images can come about in two ways. Either the scene is naturally bright and white, such as a scene with a lot of snow, or you intentionally overexpose to produce a lot of white in the image. To be clear, I'm not talking about accidental overexposure. If you recall my video on winter photography, one of the things I mentioned is that one of the worst things you can do is to lose detail in bright areas like snow. High key can work extremely well when you have a very dark subject, because if you're exposing purely for the dark subject, you can capture a lot of detail cleanly. But obviously when you do that, you're likely to be overexposing other parts of the image. You will typically do this if there are parts of the image that you don't care about blowing out. A perfect example is when you have a sky that's completely overcast and it's all just gray. In those cases, you don't have a beautiful blue color or lovely textured clouds to capture, so you might as well just turn that gray into a nice bright white. Now remember when I talked about low-key images, I mentioned how the eye is attracted to anything bright. So you might think then that with high-key images, since so much of the image is bright, that the viewer will be completely distracted by those bright parts of the image. But the reality is that since in a high-key image, white is the norm, it ends up fading into the background, and so you get these wonderful minimalist images where the focus is really on the subject. When you are overexposed for high key, you'll typically be overexposing by multiple stops, and if you have highlight warnings in your camera, they'll be screaming at you. But that's a case where you just ignore the warnings because you know better. One thing to be careful of is not going too far with the overexposing. Often with subjects that have a lot of fur, if you go too far, you will lose the detail in the single strands of fur that are around the profile of the animal. You might be able to bring those back sometimes by pulling back the highlights, but it's best, just as with low-key photography where you don't want to go too dark in the camera, with high-key, don't go too bright in the camera. You can do the rest and finesse it in post-processing. Okay, so we talked about harsh light, low light, and low key and high key. And these are all things that are primarily related to exposure. Let's talk about what I call directional lighting. What I'm referring to here is cases where the light has a very obvious direction to it. It's the opposite of light spread throughout a whole scene. Let's begin with, you guessed it, backlighting. This is where the subject is between you and the light source, which is typically the sun. However, there are some times when you will be shooting at night and lights or headlights from vehicles can be used to achieve the same kind of effect. With backlighting, the subject is typically in silhouette, and sometimes there is a halo or rim of light around the subject, which is most likely to happen when the subject has a lot of fur that can let light through between the fur. To be honest, backlighting is not something that I do a lot. I feel it's a little bit overused, but sometimes I can't help myself, and it really can look great. I'm personally much more excited when the light is coming in from either the left or the right side of the image. And just as you might set up split lighting or Rembrandt lighting in the studio, when the subject is facing you and the light is coming in from the left or the right side, half of the subject may be strongly lit while the other half may be in shadow. And this can be very dramatic. When I see opportunities for side lighting that I can turn into split lighting on a subject or any other form of lighting where it's not backlighting, but it's highly directional, and so it may not be coming in exactly from the left or the right, or it may be coming in from an angle, I get really excited, and I always try to make the most of those opportunities. And when the light is very directional like that, and it's also very intense, that's when you can get the most interesting kinds of images. Dappled lighting is when the lighting is broken up by something such as trees, and this produces some kind of pattern in the lighting. You might get a similar effect in the studio with a gobo, which is like a stencil or a template that you place over a light, or if someone is standing near a window and light is streaming through the slats of a blind. These kinds of images are tricky to get right, and the placement of the subject and the photographer are often key. When I was in Zambia, there was a forest of ebony trees that I would go to every day when the sun was low, in the hope that I would capture something interesting with the sun coming in through the branches of the trees. It's very difficult to get these kinds of images right, but you just have to keep trying, and if you never try, you'll never have the opportunity. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I would like to leave you with a few other thoughts. I think there's 3 things you can keep in mind as you embark on a journey of embracing difficult lighting if you haven't already. The first step is simply being open to the possibilities and the challenges. Don't shy away from difficult lighting, but instead try to embrace it. When you see an opportunity with difficult lighting, get out there, and get out there quickly, because light changes all the time, and even when it is changing slowly, you never know what the animals might do during that time. The second step is knowing how you might deal with each situation, both in the camera and in post, is very important. It's helpful to know the dynamic range of your camera, including where you might be able to recover detail in highlights and shadows, especially without introducing noise. You also need to know where it's okay to sacrifice detail. You'll likely also find that difficult lighting situations are where less expensive lenses show their limitations in terms of how they deal with things like flares, sun stars, and chromatic aberration. The third step is evaluating how your attempts went and learning from each situation. As with anything difficult, not to mention something that might be new, there'll be plenty of times you'll fail and where you may be disappointed with the results. As always, keep at it. Evaluate your results, figure out what you need to do differently, and then try again when you have the opportunity. I bet you guys have some awesome images where you've dealt with difficult light. I'd love to hear about your experiences and any tips you might want to share. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.